Welcome to BachTalk, Thinking Through Music, the podcast of the Bach Ensemble at St. Thomas. I'm Carlton Monroe. My guest today is Adam Schoaf. Adam joins me every month to preview a Bach cantata that will be performed at an upcoming Vespers liturgy. For more details on the Bach Vespers or our concert series, please visit www.bachensemble.org. Hey Adam, how are you?
Hi Carlton, just fine.
Thank you.
Doing great. Glad to be back. How are you?
I'm great. I thank you for joining us again. As always, we're going to dive into another cantata. I mean, what could be better, right?
Yes, looking forward to it. It's another good one.
This is a really interesting one, too, and a nice one. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about it. I was thinking about a different cantata that Bach wrote for the same gospel lesson, the Good Samaritan, Cantata 77, which we did. I'm going to have to look this up. It was it may have been last year. I hope it wasn't this fall. No, it was last year. And we did that cantata, and it is a dramatically different cantata, just in every way. So, but anyway, I'm interested to hear about this. So why don't we go ahead? I'll turn it over to you and take us through this piece.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think I remember when you did BWV 77 last year, and it's so great that you mentioned it. You've kind of set up part of my talk very well here. So
perfect.
I'll go ahead and take it away with this new Good Samaritan cantata. So, today's cantata, Ihr, die ihr euch von Christo nennet, or You Who Call Yourselves Christians, Bach composed for the 13th Sunday after Trinity in the Lutheran calendar. The Gospel reading for that Sunday came from Luke chapter 10, verses 23 to 37, the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan. In this passage, Jesus is questioned by a lawyer about the secret to eternal life. And Jesus responds to love God with heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. When the lawyer then asks, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus answers him with a story. A man is traveling the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He is assaulted by robbers who leave him half dead. A priest and a Levite come along, but neglecting his suffering, they pass by on the other side. But then a Samaritan approaches and takes compassion on the wounded man. He binds him up, sets him on his animal, transports him to an inn, and pays for the man's lodging. Jesus then asks the lawyer, which of these three was a neighbor to the wounded man? When the lawyer says, "He who showed mercy on him," Jesus commands, "Go and do likewise." Today we have three surviving cantatas from Bach composed for the 13th Sunday after Trinity. There's the aforementioned BWV 77, Du sollst Gott deinen Herrn lieben, which Bach composed in 1723. The next year, 1724, was BWV 33, Allein zu dir, Herr Jesu Christ. And then finally, BWV 164, Ihr, die ihr euch von Christo nennet, followed in 1725. I think an illuminating way to experience Bach's cantatas is to listen to all the cantatas composed for the same Sunday. Listen to them together, because it gives you a chance to hear how Bach responded to the same scripture passage in different ways. BWV 77 and 33 share a couple of similarities. Both open with very impressive chorale fantasias sung by four-part chorus. And both also focus their texts on expressing love and devotion to God. There are passing references to loving one's neighbor, but the emphasis in these two earlier cantatas falls more on the first part of the Samaritan parable, where Jesus commands us to love God with heart, soul, strength, and mind. In those cantatas, the sentiments are directed from the narrator to God. In BWV 164, our attention shifts to the second part of the Samaritan parable, with its story of human suffering and compassion. The narrator's words are now directed not to God, but outward to the Christian community. And we see it right away in the cantata's title, "You all who call yourselves of Christ." There's also a preponderance of the pronouns we and us. So in this third cantata, Bach challenges his listeners and asks if they are responsive to their neighbor's suffering, if they are compassionate like the Samaritan. The cantata opens with a call-out. The solo tenor, playing the role of pastor, admonishes his congregation. "You who claim to be of Christ, where resides the compassion by which one recognizes Christ's members? It is, alas, all quite distant from you. Hearts should be rich in love, yet yours are harder than stone." The speaker is obviously quite irritated by Christian hypocrisy, and Bach's music captures this feeling of discontent. Here's the opening of this first movement on the screen. The key is G minor. The meter is 9/8, and we can see from just the number of black notes on the page that there's a lot of rhythmic activity in all four string parts. And all of this together creates a backdrop that sounds churning and restless. It captures an emotion of simmering, righteous anger. The other element that I want to mention about this opening is the musical canon that forms between the first and second violin parts. And I've placed red boxes around those two parts. In a musical canon, one voice begins a melody, and then after a certain interval of time, a second voice begins with the same melody. Here, the first violin is the leading voice, and we can see that the second violin is the following voice, plays the same melody, note for note, but it's trailing by a measure. This continues then until measure 5, when the two parts diverge into independent lines. As we will see, musical canons appear frequently in this cantata. This now naturally raises the question, why? Well, a survey of Bach's output shows that he turned to canon and other strict forms of counterpoint whenever he was setting music that referred to biblical law. So the strictness of the law is symbolized by the strictness of the music. You must follow the law just as closely as one musical part must follow another. And canon is especially appropriate on this Sunday. Recall that in the parable, Jesus commands his listeners to follow the example of the Good Samaritan. He says, "Go and do likewise." And so in this musical canon, the first violin sets the example, and then the second violin goes and plays likewise. Let's listen to the opening of this movement and try to tune your ears to the canon and the violins, then also just take note of the churning atmosphere that Bach establishes in this opening movement. Dig a little deeper into this canon melody. As you heard in the previous sound clip, after the violins played in the introduction, the tenor repeats it for his opening line. Something I noticed while I was studying this movement is that the canon melody appears to be derived from a trumpet obbligato part that occurred in BWV 77, which you'll recall was the cantata that Bach composed for the 13th Sunday after Trinity in 1723, so 2 years before BWV 164. And I've put the two melodies here on the screen, and I think it helps our comparison if we break the melodies into 3 sections. And I've put colored boxes around these 3 sections, red, green, and blue. Looking at the red boxes then, we can see that both melodies start with the same intervals. The trumpet part on top is in D minor, but it begins with a falling fifth from A to D. It steps down a half step to C sharp, and then comes back to D. The tenor melody below follows the same intervals, but in the key of G minor. So D falls a fifth to G, steps down to F sharp, and then comes back to G. After this, the melodies have different rhythms, but they follow similar contours. In the second segment, which I've placed in the green boxes, both melodies rise to the fourth note of their respective scales before descending back to the tonic. So in the trumpet melody on top, this rises to G and then comes back down to D. The tenor melody on the bottom goes up to C and then falls to G. Finally, in the last segment of the melody, and again, this is in the blue box, both parts make a big jump up and then gradually descend back down by step. Now, in my opinion, these similarities are too extensive to be coincidental. I suspect that maybe what Bach did here was that as he was preparing to compose Cantata 164, maybe he pulled Cantata 77 off the shelf, perhaps to review what he had composed before, or maybe just to get his creative juices flowing. I wonder if maybe he saw the trumpet melody from the earlier cantata and it stuck in his mind, and he eventually developed it into the full polyphonic treatment that we see in BWV 164. I'll let you listen to both of these melodies now back to back. Here's the trumpet melody to start. Let's take this canon melody just one step further. Remember that in the third segment of this melody, it involves a big leap up. In the trumpet melody of BWV 77, this leap was a minor sixth, from D up to B flat. In the tenor aria of BWV 164, where there's now a text to set, Bach expands the big leap to an octave from G up to high G. What makes this significant is that the octave leap happens on the word Christo. Since the Middle Ages, the octave had been recognized as a perfect interval because of its pure consonant sound. To place an octave leap on the word Christo, then, is to make a statement about the perfection of Christ. And I think this interpretation is bolstered by what happens just a few measures later. As we can see in the lower example on the screen, the tenor sings, "Wo bleibet die Barmherzigkeit?" Where is your compassion? And then when he adds one more wo, or where, the music leaps up from an F sharp to an F natural. So it's not a perfect octave, but it's a half step less. It's a major seventh, an interval that sounds dissonant and jabbing. Bach uses awkward intervals then throughout this movement as he interrogates his community. Wo, where, is sometimes a major seventh. Wo sometimes is a minor sixth. But the musical effect conveys a subtle theological message. Christ is perfection, symbolized by the octave. Hypocritical humanity, on the other hand, is addressed with imperfect and dissonant intervals, and this is an expression of the narrator's anger. So let's now hear the tenor's entrance up to this point so that you can hear both of these phrases. movement aria, we shift from the narrator's righteous anger to a call for compassion. The text reads, "Only through love and through compassion will we be the same as God himself. Hearts like a Samaritan's are pained by the pains of others and abound with compassion." Besides the text, Bach also softens the musical tone. The solo aria features the alto, the rich voice part that Bach often used when he wanted to represent the pained or repentant soul. Supporting the alto, we have two flutes and continuo. This is one less part than we had in the first movement, and so already the musical texture is not quite so thick. And the flutes will also provide a gentler, less aggressive tone than the strings. Bach also softens the mood through the use of a particular melodic figure, and I've placed a red box around it. It occurs right at the very beginning when the first flute enters with 4/16 notes placed into two groups of two by the slur markings. Dee-dum-da-dum-bum, ba-dee-da-dee-dum-dum. And this two-note grouping, this dee-dum, dee-dum, was a common Baroque musical symbol for sadness because it kind of simulates weeping. You'll hear this figure permeating the aria in all parts, flutes, alto, and continuo. And the idea here is that by depicting a musical image of weeping, pained compassion, Bach is trying to inspire feelings of compassion in his congregation. He is inviting the listener to go and feel likewise. Finally, viewers who read music have probably already noticed that we have another canon in this aria. The first flute begins a melody with the weeping figure in measure 1. This is then answered in the second measure by the second flute, with the same melody but just transposed down a fourth. The two parts diverge after a short time, but their imitation throughout the movement sends a clear message. Just as the Samaritan's heart is attentive to the suffering of others, the listener is encouraged to follow his example, just as closely as one flute follows another. Let's listen then to the beginning of this movement so that you can observe the imitation between the flutes, as well as the prevalence of that dee-da-dee-da weeping figure that I mentioned. Finally, I want to make a few points about the fifth movement aria, a duet for soprano and bass. Here's the text. Hands that do not close themselves will be taken up to heaven. Eyes that flow with charity are viewed by the Savior with grace. Unto hearts that strive for love will God himself give his heart. Let's think now about the texts that we've looked at so far. The first movement, I said, was accusatory. The third movement was a call to compassion. And now this fifth movement suggests that compassion will have its reward. I think that this idea of reciprocation may have been on Bach's mind as he composed this movement. Here on the screen we can see the music for the opening. In this aria, Bach includes all of the treble instruments together on the melody. 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 violins. Maybe they might represent collectively all of humanity. Notice that their first 3 notes, D, F sharp, G, bear a close resemblance to the notes of the first movement canon. But then look at what happens in the continuo part. The melody is answered in inversion. This is going to be a canon in inversion. In other words, the leading voice plays a melody, and then the following voice plays the melody, but with all of the intervals flipped upside down. Now, I've added red boxes again to help us see this. If you look at the flute, oboe, violin part, you'll see that the melody first drops down a 6th D to F sharp, and then it rises by step G, A, B flat, C before circling around the B flat. The continuo part presents the mirror image of this. Its melody first rises a 6th G to E flat, then it descends by step D, C, B flat, A before also circling around the B flat. Okay, so once again, this is what we call an inverted canon. And what's impressive about an inverted canon is that even though the parts are moving in inversion, in opposite directions, and at different times, Bach still makes them sound good together. Now, this raises another question. In a cantata that already shows us different canons, why does Bach introduce an inverted canon here? Well, I think it's inspired by the text. The text says that hands that are open will be taken up to heaven. Eyes that flow with charity will be viewed by the Savior with grace. Hearts that strive for love will receive God's heart. In other words, the compassion you show to others will be turned back to you, measure for measure. And I think that Bach is trying to convey this idea of reciprocation through the inverted canon. And so if the flute, oboe, violin line on top represents humanity's behavior, then the continuo line represents the divine reciprocal response. And once again, the use of canon underlines the idea that this is the law. So let's listen then to this opening with this very brief inverted canon. The rest of this aria then reprises some ideas we've already seen in previous movements. The soprano and bass imitate each other in canon on various phrases of the text, and again, this emphasizes the idea of going and doing likewise. Later in the movement, and I put this part here on the screen, when the voices sing Augen, die Mitleiden fließen, or eyes that flow with charity, Bach uses slur markings to recall those 2 note groupings, the D-da, that symbolize tears or weeping. And so by recalling these ideas, this movement provides a kind of musical summation of what we've heard before. So let's hear this clip. To our podcast listeners, I hope that you found this look at BWV 164 enlightening. I do believe that this cantata kind of makes us work a little bit more for understanding. It's not as immediately accessible as last month's cantata, Es reiset euch ein schreckliche Ende, where the apocalyptic imagery was just right there on the surface and impossible to miss. Today's cantata, BWV 164, demands that we look a little bit more closely and think about Bach's use of canon which itself is very kind of intellectual sort of musical exercise. But what we must realize is that sometimes this is the level that Bach worked at. This is how he expressed meaning. And so if we want to get to know his cantatas, sometimes we just have to kind of roll our sleeves up and do some of this analytical work. And so I want to thank our listeners and congratulate you on working through this cantata with me. As with the inverted canon that we looked at earlier in the fifth movement, I do believe that the effort that we put in here will be rewarded on the listening. So, thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Adam. That was, as always, insightful and wonderful. I admit the reciprocal idea it musically depicted is something I hadn't noticed right away. I mean, I noticed the inverted canon, but I hadn't thought about it in terms of the text, which was really just incredible. It's interesting. There are a couple of things about this cantata that are interesting and striking to me. The first is the sort of dramatic arch of this cantata is very different than a lot of them. It begins very aggressively, accusatory, almost insulting, right, to a listener.
He calls out the congregation at the beginning.
Yeah, and then it moves through the story, which naturally moves through the heartless people who pass the injured man to the grace and kindness and care of the Samaritan. And that arc through the cantata is very interesting and very atypical. So many dramatic musical works build to a peak moment and then dissipate, but this one really has a different shape to it. The other thing I can't help but think is, that the alto aria where it's depicting the compassion of the Samaritan with the two flutes and that descending motif, it reminds me so much of one of the early arias in the St. Matthew Passion, where the woman washes Jesus' head with water, and the disciples chide her and say, why are you wasting this? Why are you wasting this? And Jesus says, what are you doing? Leave her alone. She has done me a good thing. Yeah. And the aria, the alto aria that follows, has two flutes, both with a descending motif in the recit and the aria. And that was, Matthew Passion was 4 years after this cantata. So I have to believe that sentiment was still in Bach's mind when he wrote that piece too. And I hadn't thought of that until I saw your analysis as well. So that was really, really striking.
Yeah. It seems like he kind of gets this idea for the affect, or that, setting that kind of story.
And it's hard to know whether that was
same instrumentation and everything too.
Yeah, exactly. He just sort of, it's hard to know if that's intentional or if that's just his way of operating, is that when he's thinking about charity or kindness, he immediately thinks flutes and alto,
Yeah, and these kind of also just sort of sad weeping scenes, just intense compassion. Yeah, I guess that's just sort of a sound that he went to.
Yeah. I did want to mention, for people who are listening to this podcast, thank you for doing that. But you can also watch the video version of this podcast on YouTube. And a lot of times that's an excellent way, because of the music examples that Adam shares. It's really nice to be able to see those too. So regardless of how you like to experience this podcast, I wanted to make sure you all were aware of the other options, because there's some wonderful ways to enjoy this. All right. Well, Adam, we will not have a podcast with you in December because we won't have a Vesper service, but we will have you in person doing a pre-concert talk for our December 12th concert of the Bach-Tet. It is a Christmas concert at St. Gertrude Catholic Church in Madeira, and you'll be set up there ahead of time to do a talk there. And so I just want to encourage everyone, if you are going to miss the podcast presentation in December, just come and join us in person for that. It should be wonderful.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that. I always say I like to talk with my A-plus students who show up at the pre-concert lecture, and yeah, it's always great to discuss the music with them. So looking
And it'll
forward
be
to
a
it very
very
much.
different repertoire to talk about
Yes.
too. So,
Yep.
all right. Well, thanks so much for helping us out again.
Thank you so much, Carlton. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to BachTalk, Thinking Through Music from the Bach Ensemble at St. Thomas. I hope you'll subscribe and join us again for future episodes.